As stated by the Aga Khan, there are four elements that strengthen a democracy, and the second element is independent media. Now we know mainstream media is nothing more than a propaganda wheel for those who are stakeholders. But independent media is very important, and most would agree with that, given it is a time of manipulated and controlled narrative. When the Aga Khan speaks of independent media, he is referring to sources such as BuzzFeed, the media that maintains mainstream narrative within an alternative medium. The Aga Khan is the champion of pluralism and diversity, and the capital investor and resource manager of the marginalized. It is the narrative of the marginalized that is most often manipulated and controlled by media, misinforming the public. From Islam as the religion of peace, to pushing the feminist and LGBT, establishing empathetic reasoning within a society. All are narratives that the Aga Khan has been emphasizing for decades within Western nations and the United Nations.
A second key variable for enhancing democratic effectiveness is the critical role of competent and independent media voices.
When you discuss the competencies of media, are you referring to content or exposure? Now let's turn our attention to the aptitude of the New York Times. Did they not just hire an Asian woman who has a history of bigoted comments in social media regarding white people, and white men in particular? And how is the New York Times when looking at misinformation and fake news? And the question is, how much further can independent media take the mainstream narrative? The mainstream, up until recently, could not make blatant racist remarks. Independent media can. And who is the heroes and who is the villains? From mainstream media to independent media, Islam and the marginalized are placed on a pedestal, while Caucasians, and in particularly Caucasian males, are demonized. So when the Aga Khan, leader and imam of a Shia Ismaili sect, and the champion of pluralism, states that media requires demographic plurality, his statement doesn't seem to be truly inclusive, in so much that the voices of heterosexual white males, or rather the dominant culture, is being vilified.
So the age-old promise of democracy is that social cohesion and public progress could be achieved by consensus rather than by coercion. But genuine democratic consent depends on dependable public information.
Social cohesion and progress are the necessary and sufficient conditions required for democratic consensus. And without a precise definition of statehood and culture, a consensus cannot be achieved. With the Aga Khan's vigor to have pluralism in the West and only the West is the primary factor responsible for the breakdown of a dominant culture and a definition of statehood in Western nations. The Aga Khan is abolishing that which is the foundation of consensus and a stable democracy. And you are attempting to use media as a tool of manipulation, manipulating the naive and the mentally feeble into a globalist concept. Pair this with the Aga Khan's control of education in the West through the AKDN's cooperation agreements, you have just applied the age-old Amazonian notion in that if you get the minds of children between 0 and 5, you own them for the rest of their lives.
All around the world, authoritarian rulers increasingly use media to coerce the consent of the governed.
Let's start out with a brief description of authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is a form of government characterized by strong central power and limited political freedoms. Individual freedoms subordinate to state authority, and there is no constitutional accountability under an authoritarian regime. In our last video, we established the Aga Khan is attempting to change culture and statehood through the manipulation of Western constitutions and posturing theological politics.
Recently published a remarkable description of this phenomenon under the headline, The Velvet Glove.
With relentless effort, you advocate for Western acceptance and tolerance of pluralism. My concern is that your concept of pluralism in the West is defined as a form of multiculturalism. Yet in the East and in Africa, pluralism is defined by the secular aspects of Islam, and Islam only. which is presently going through a consolidation process known as the Ummah. I guess this is the reason why the developing world has driven out Christianity and has become exclusively Islamic.
The power of a leader's reasoning, or the truth of his arguments, the report suggests, are often less important than his command of media influence. What results can be the illusion of democracy, but not its substance.
This power of media over reasoning and argumentation is due to the fact that the range and scope of the leader's message is limited to time and place, this resulting in a restraint of repetition. Also, we as humans tend to be reactive, more so than active. We are guilty of complacency, and our complacency is resulting from Western culture being based on access and not obtainment. Media, much like education's use of repetition, is an indoctrination process, working on memorization which reinforces a narrative. But how does a message transition from a thought to a behavior? That can be answered through what is known as operant conditioning. The transition of a behavior from being condoned into a behavior which is neutralized, ultimately into the behavior being accepted as suitable. This is achieved through repetition and reinforcement, and is indoctrinated within the actor through a system of reward and punishment programming. A greater understanding of this practice of behavioral modification will be a topic in future videos, so stay tuned to the Y Perspective.
Nor can we rely on advances in communication and technologies which overcome the obstacles of distance and diversity. In fact, new media technologies have often made matters worse.
How might that be? Because conservative white heterosexual males are now given a voice by way of the advancements of media and communication technology. The restraints don't work anymore. Because when I look at the mainstream and independent alternative media, there are so many groups that have no recourse to their voices being heard. For example, Islamic extremist groups can have their voice in social media and even use it as a recruiting tool. Any marginalized racial or gender group can spout hatred of self and others, and even pedophiles are allowed to have a presence. What have we let happen? Now, the group that oftentimes opposes mainstream media's message and is the voice that is restrained by mainstream and independent media alike is the heterosexual white male. The issue is that technology advancements have given heterosexual white males their voices back, and their voices have become quite loud since the election of Donald Trump. Hoorah!
Quantitative advances in communication technology have not necessarily produced qualitative progress in mutual understanding. To be sure, each improvement in communications technology has triggered new waves of political optimism. But sadly, if information can be shared more easily as technology advances, so can misinformation and disinformation.
I find the concept of misinformation and disinformation and even fake news really entertaining. If the information of mainstream media or independent media like the Young Turks and BuzzFeed had any merit, then why is it that their information cannot withstand debate or negotiation, but rather opposition is merely confronted by removals and bans like InfoWars and so many others?
Often what counts most is in our extended societies is not what one is for, but who one is against.
If this human condition relative to difference is understood, why pluralism would ever be considered a strength? As stated by the Aga Khan, acceptance of difference is not innate and must be trained through empathetic reasoning. But an interesting fact about the human propensity to spot differences is that it is one of our strongest traits, especially among likenesses. Hence the racialized comment of one racial group referring to another as they all look the same. So once again, just like the mantra of your marginalized militia that you fund, socially constructed reality must be greater than biological reality. Or so you want us to think. Mentally feeble and irrational, welcome to our future.
Populations are much larger, more widely scattered, and more diverse. They cannot most easily be mobilized And when they are mobilized, it is generally around vivid but superficial symbols and negative propositions.
What do you need to mobilize people for? In the West, survival and ownership are the key motivators of a population. It is also a call to action when a society's core principles of identity and statehood are challenged.
It is not the power of our tools, but how we use them that will determine our future. Among other things, this means prioritizing the role of independent media, and indeed of a multiplicity of independent voices. Demographic pluralism must be reflected in healthy media pluralism.
These powerful tools have made the Aga Khan's agenda of global control fleeting, and how these tools have been used are a twofold system. First, you have the narrative control, achieved through restraint and restriction of competing voices. Second is the scope and range of the controlled narrative. Like advertising, the left's message of hatred and supremacy is everywhere and on a constant loop. Independent media, as stated by the Aga Khan, is like a word-of-mouth sale. When a message is delivered by a common voice and not an authoritative body, people tend to perceive the message with a greater level of trust. It's not a sales pitch, but rather an experience. Now, when you bring together the application of a message's range and scope with an experience-based testimony and not a sales pitch, the manipulation can get unnerving. Look at contemporary health trends. Most will kill you in the long run. We are all susceptible to manipulation, or rather motivation. Now, when the Aga Khan speaks of demographic media pluralism, he is speaking of the access of the marginalized. He is the main benefactor of the marginalized. But as we watch your concept of pluralism be applied in reality, it is nothing more than restraining and restricting of a nation's identity and culture. In the West, that being heterosexual white males. If you don't want your history and identity to be erased, this insanity and self-hatred must be stopped. Like, share, and subscribe. Click that notification button and check us out on social media. Links are in the description below.